Well, Dan Perry is an Israeli political analyst and the former chief editor of the Associated Press in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He's joining us live from Tel Aviv again. Thank you very much indeed again for being with us, Dan. So we heard Masoud Pezeshkian there, the Iranian president, essentially saying, paying tribute to the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. At the same time, our correspondent Ali Hashem saying that this is all about continuity, that there is going to be no break in leadership as far as Iran is concerned. How concerned do you think Israel's leadership is going to be, given the fact that it seemed as though regime change was exactly what they were aiming for?
They're obviously going to be concerned that this, in the end, doesn't achieve as much as they hope. But I think both Netanyahu and Trump could tolerate an end to the war that basically imposes terms on Iran, even if the Islamic Republic lives to claim survival another day. They prefer that the regime collapse, probably. But on the other hand, a collapse of the regime entirely could lead to unpredictable outcomes that could be dangerous for everyone, including if Iran falls apart or if terrorism spills over its borders somehow and destabilizes other countries. It's conceivable, certainly from the perspective of President Trump in the U.S., that a perfectly acceptable situation would be keeping the mafia, from his perspective, in place, having decapitated it, rendering Trump the capo di tutti capi, and rendering that mafia somewhat domesticated so that it does what America wants. That is more or less analogous to the model of what Trump pursued in Venezuela, where much to the shock of many idealistic observers who were willing to tolerate the dubious legality of the abduction of Maduro, having abducted Maduro and having created a symbolic victory of a decapitation of the regime, he was happy to keep the Chavista regime in place. It's conceivable that some version of that could occur in Iran also, especially because I agree that Ali Hashem is completely correct. A full and immediate and clear binary transition to a new system in Iran is going to be difficult, both because although the existing regime is unpopular, and I think overwhelmingly unpopular, they do have support, and they have support of men with guns. And so some accommodation is going to be necessary, quite probably, and we may see a messy transition period. The worst outcome from Israel's perspective is that the regime survives and that its mulishness on the issues at hand, which are not just a nuclear issue and a ballistic missile issue, but especially a proxy issue, with Iran spreading chaos and instability around a region for decades, that is maintained. I think that'll be hard. And a guy like Pezeshkian, who lives in the Euclidean universe, I think he knows that. So who knows? Maybe they'll live to fight another day, but I think they're going to have to show some give in the terms of surrender.
This was broadly a U.S. and Israeli operation. It was started off by Israel, who sent in jets, obviously, and carried out the bombing that killed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Israel must have, when it was planning this out, must have realized what the kind of response that Iran was going to put in place, and that response would probably involve Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, the UAE. All nations, all countries, of course, which Israel has been anxious, previously under the Abraham Accords that was put forward, to improve relationships with. What's your assessment of that dynamic now? Do you think that there is no opportunity at all for any sort of rapprochement between these nations, given what has happened?
I think in the Middle East, you have to distinguish between what is said in public and what is real. We've all heard the reports that are extremely credible that Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia secretly encouraged Trump to attack, even when the country's public posture was something somewhat different. Most of the nations of the GCC are no friends of the Islamic Republic, friends of Iran, potentially, but not of the Islamic Republic. Qatar might be an exception. I'm not even so sure about that, given that Qatar is allied with the U.S. and hosts an enormous U.S. base. I think it's no surprise that these countries are facing some Iranian reprisals. So far, it hasn't been catastrophic in terms of the outcome. We'll have to wait and see where it goes, because, of course, Iran can ultimately, if they want to double down and if they want to play for time, they can cause a lot more damage. But I think at the moment, despite the pain that Iran has inflicted. And we see in Israel about 10 deaths in the past 24 hours. That's far from nothing. I think nothing that's happened has been a terrible surprise, except for perhaps for the degree of success that Israel's had in killing not only Khamenei, but about 40 very prominent and key personalities, with the exception of Pezeshkian. And I have to wonder whether that is a coincidence, because there is some notion that Pezeshkian, as a man of science, as a non-cleric, as a member of the Azeri minority in Iran, might, were he to emerge in the new balance of power in Iran as significant, could be a force that could make good on his reputation as being a reformist.
Our correspondent Nooradi was describing to us that after the attacks that happened in June, the missiles that Israel uses for its Iron Dome protection system and also its ground-to-air missiles generally stocks of those had actually run significantly low, certainly low enough to concern people within the Israeli leadership. How confident do you think Israel can be at the moment that it can maintain a prolonged conflict if indeed, as we've been talking about, there is very little change in the leadership and there is continuity in the regime and the attacks keep coming from Iran?
Well, the $64,000 question is which runs out first, Israel's Iron Dome and other defenses or Iran's missiles, which is why you see the priority for Israel right now and the Americans is to take out the missile launchers and to destroy the missile capacity in general in Iran. I think Israel is not sanguine about the idea that its interceptors are not unlimited in number, but I do think they're quite confident that they can outlast the Iranian capacity to send missiles. And we know that Iran is, quite careful about its missile economy. They're not firing 500 missiles at once, which would almost guarantee a lot more damage in Israel. There's a reason for that, because they're trying to hold on to that capacity. They will eventually run out. It's also significant that Israel has not just Arrow 3 and Iron Dome, but also various U.S. Shield systems, and I do believe that's one reason why the Gerald Ford is parked right off the coast of Israel.
Talk to us about your assessment, about how people in Israel are viewing these attacks on Iran, but also the potential of Iran's response.
As we've discussed many times, Israel is a country that's divided on most political issues, and the government of Netanyahu is not particularly popular. And Iran successes aside, he would probably lose elections had they been held last week. So, of course, you're going to hear a lot of cynicism about Netanyahu when many people in Israel believe that he's certainly capable of making, decisions about when to start a war based on political expedience. That's a given. Israel's full of cynicism, not unwarranted, about Netanyahu. That said, one or two vox pops is never going to capture the big picture. And the big picture in Israel is that they'd be delighted for the Islamic Republic regime to fall. They really do believe the Iranian people are their friends. I realize this may sound naive or fantastical, but that feeling is strong in Israel, because they remember the era under the Shah when the two countries were good friends, and there are contacts below the radar between Israelis and Iranians all the time, and Israeli singers in Persian, have fans in Iran, and on and on. So hard as it may be for some viewers to believe, the feeling is strong in Israel that they're doing Iranians a favor. Of course, the main issue is that they want to rid Israel of the threats that they perceive coming from the Islamic Republic. Now, again, is that paranoia? I don't think so. I mean, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, these are all, to different degrees, along with Islamic Jihad, creatures of Iran. Iran has funded and aided and trained and guided these groups for decades. Iran has more than hinted that they seek the destruction of Israel. So even though Israelis may fear a successful Iranian reprisal, and certainly we saw a version of that today with 9 people being killed in Beit Shemesh. I think as long as Iron Dome and the Arrow system and the other systems more or less work and continue to prove, while not invulnerable, very effective, there will be support for this, no matter what they think Netanyahu's ultimate goals might be, whether he might benefit politically or not. This is a question of Israel piggybacking on the very valid excuse that Iran gave the Americans by massacring, by most reports, tens of thousands of their own people in the protests last month. They gave the world a plausible argument for intervention based on a principle of responsibility to protect, where there is a point where sovereignty is cast aside in favor of the need to rescue people from a government that is not prepared to brook dissent.
The leader of the opposition in Israel, Yair Lapid, has essentially said that by cutting off the leadership within Iran, that will promote change from within. It will give the opportunity for people to rise up and take over their own country. His words, his interpretation. That is also a view that has been reiterated by Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump himself. If that doesn't happen, if people do not do that and rise up against the regime, and the regime essentially stays the same, because that is how, as we've been hearing over the last couple of hours, the Iranian system is built. What is that going to mean for the faith that Israelis might have in Benjamin Netanyahu, Yair Lapid, and indeed Donald Trump?
I mean, they'll be less satisfied, but I don't think it'll change the bottom line. My actual what I'm wondering is whether 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 months down the line, when Israelis go to the polls, whether a big success in Iran might affect Netanyahu's prospects. That is also a massive pivotal point, because Netanyahu gone is a whole different kind of Israel than Lapid and his group being in charge. But the quote that you brought underscores the truth of what I say. Lapid, who's a liberal, who's a highly pro-Western, very democratic liberal, precisely because he's a liberal, would like to see Iran liberated. And that reflects a degree of consensus on this one particular issue in Israel that is surprising and somewhat belies what you might assume because of all the cynicism. That is also the case, but is a little bit irrelevant to this particular issue of Iran. I think this matter will be decided in terms of its outcome by the level of success. And already, I think Israel and the U.S. Will be able to say we've achieved a version of success by decapitating pretty much the entire leadership of the Islamic Republic in 1 or 2 days. Even if they're replaced by a different version of a leadership of the Islamic Republic, the U.S. and Israel might assume that that new leadership will be a little less reckless than the previous one was in rejecting American ultimatums. And in displaying tremendous indifference to the position of pretty much the entire West, and I would dare say, with the exception of maybe China and Russia, most of the world, in the idea that they cannot have a nuclear weapon, they cannot have clearly offensive intended ballistic missiles, and most definitely they cannot continue to spread jihad through militias around the Middle East. All of that, I think, is game over for Iran. And Khamenei seemed to not comprehend it. And I think the U.S. and Israel might be hoping that a new regime, even if they claim that they stand for continuity, and even if it fails to effectively rescue the Iranian people, which is a legitimate goal of the attackers in this case, even so, they might be more flexible on these issues. I would be very surprised if in the long term, the United States suffices with business as usual with Iran and accepting, for example, that Iran actually thinks it's okay to maintain the power of Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas and the Shiite militias in Iraq. I think that is sort of done. And even if the Iranian Republic survives as an oppression mechanism vis-a-vis its own people, as a chaos machine in the Middle East, it may not.
Dan Perry, we appreciate you being with us on Al Jazeera. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.